Hey everyone, and welcome to this Rhino Dehorning brief brought to you by the Conservation Academy. My name is Joel Alves, and this video forms part of our ongoing series of wildlife, veterinary, and conservation science. If you're interested in more videos like this, please follow the link below or at the end of this video. Let's crack on. All right, so what is dehorning? Essentially, dehorning is the removal of a rhino's horn in what should be a non-painful way. A horn is essentially made up of tubules of keratinized cells. So in a simplistic sense, it's almost like your fingernail. And at the base of your fingernail, you've got your nail bed where that nail grows from. And you know, if you biting your nails or you cut your nail too deeply and you hit that nail bed, it's painful and it bleeds. And it's the same principle for a rhino. So if we cut that horn too deeply and we hit the growth plate where that horn is growing from, then it's going to bleed and it's going to be painful. And so it should be non-painful in the sense that we avoid that as much as possible. And over time, we've developed methods that make it safer, and we understand a little bit of where that growth plate is. So very simply put, dehorning is the removal of a rhino's horn. And why do we do it? In essence, what we're trying to achieve is to change what a lot of people speak about in terms of the risk and rewards ratio. So the risk is what a would-be poacher sees when they approach a reserve and they want to go onto that reserve with the intention of poaching. The risk is of them getting captured, of them coming into contact with an anti-poaching unit and getting into a gunfight, dangerous animals on the property, whatever the risk is when someone's considering to go and poach on a reserve. The reward ultimately is obviously the horn that a poacher gets once they've killed a rhino. So what we're trying to change is to remove that reward as much as possible, so taking off as much of that horn as we possibly can. And at the same time, and what's really important, is the reserves are constantly improving their security and their anti-poaching. So you're increasing the risk and you're bringing down the reward. Where reserves are just doing dehorning, it's unfortunately not a very successful tool. You have to improve your security, you have to have security, and you have to have other things at play that you're doing on that reserve. On reserves where we're dehorning and security and community outreach and a whole lot of a widespread program is improving, then we're seeing fantastic success, and actually nothing better than that at the moment, at least in the landscapes that we're working. So it is a really positive tool to use. It's obviously something we don't want to be doing for the rest of our lives. Rhino are long-lived species. The horn grows back, and the fact that it grows back means this is a repeatable process. So every 18 to 24 months, we need to do this again, and we obviously don't want to do this multiple times in a rhino's life. But for the most part, at least until we can come up with a better plan, this is the best way forward. And to look at a little bit on how the process works, so in essence, the biggest challenge is to actually locate the rhino that we want to work on. In this massive open system reserves, the rhino are completely free roaming. We don't know where they are at every moment, so we need to go out there and find them. And the way we do that is one of two ways. The most cost-effective and efficient is to use a small, light sport aircraft or a little fixed wing. They'll fly around and they'll fly in grids, gridding little sections of the property up and down, and they'll be looking for rhino. Once they find them, they will relay that to us on the ground, and that'll be the veterinary and the helicopter team. And then we'll mobilize the ground team closer to the rhino, and once they're close to where the fixed wing has spotted them, then the helicopter and the vet will get airborne and they'll move into position to go and immobilize those rhino. So what that looks like is once we locate the rhino, whoever the veterinarian is in charge will look at the size and the makeup. We might have multiple animals, it might just be an individual. We decide on the dose based on the body size. The immobilizing cocktail ultimately is an ultra-potent opioid. It's known as etorphine. It's in the same drug class as morphine. It's just much, much stronger, depending on which book you read. Some people say 8,000 to 10,000 times stronger. So it's extremely, extremely potent. And what that means is we can use a really, really small amount to actually knock out a massive rhino. To that, we add what's called a zaparone. It's another drug that's more of a tranquilizer, but it also counteracts some of the negative effects that we get with etorphine, especially with the relation to blood pressure effects. And then we add another sort of adjuvant called hyaluronidase or hyalase. And what that does is when the dart hits and the drug is injected into the tissue, it just helps the drug to get absorbed a little bit quicker. It just means that we can have that rhino down and in hand another minute to 2 minutes faster, which is great from the perspective that it's not running a long distance or anything like that. How the dart looks in essence, This is what it looks like. So this is a 2 cc dart. It means it can take 2 mils of fluid. Just shows you how little the amount is that we actually need to immobilize a rhino. And then the very important thing is the length of the needle. So as you can imagine, a rhino has incredibly thick skin, and we need to make sure that that dart penetrates the skin, goes through the skin into the muscle tissue where the blood supplies, and that's where the drug is essentially absorbed from. How we get that dart into the rhino is through a dart gun or a dart projector. There are a number of different dart guns out there, but the one that we'll be typically using is called a 389. It uses a little 2-2 blank cartridge, so that sits over here in the chamber, and you load that cartridge. There's a little power selector on the back, which you then judge your distance, and that's where you select your power, and then the dart just goes into a little chamber at the top here into the barrel. So once you pull the trigger, there's a little explosion inside the dart gun. It shoots out, and then it goes into the rhino. So in the dart itself, there's a little percussion cap at the back here. So as soon as it hits the rhino, there's a little explosion at the back of the dart, and that pushes the drug straight into the rhino. So what's quite important with the darting is that you want to try and hit the rhino in a big muscle mass. So usually the hindquarters, sometimes you can get lucky on the top of the spinal column. But it's quite important to be perpendicular so that your needle doesn't bend, and to get a good muscle mass so that the drug is properly absorbed. I usually don't like to say in a briefing where I want to try and hit the rhino, because very often we're on an operation and there's a dart sitting in a tail, in the bottom of a leg, or in some arbitrary place that everyone wonders, why it's sitting there. And unfortunately, you don't always get it right. But ultimately, you're trying to get a really good placed dart in the hindquarters. Our pilots, we've worked with them a long time, and they're really good at positioning us nice and close. Most of your darts are going to be anywhere from about 10 to 15 meters, so it's really not that far. If you're doing multiple animals in a group, you want to try and get your darts in as quickly as possible. So if we're doing 2 up to as many as 5, 6 animals, you want to try and get your darts in as quickly as possible into all of those rhino, and then pull off pressure with the helicopters so that they stick together as a nice family unit. Now, where the helicopter becomes important once the dart is in, is that the helicopter will move the rhino to an area where we can work as a ground team. And typically that's on a road that'll be close to where the ground teams will be waiting. And you try and negotiate those rhino using the helicopter into a better area where we can safely work with them. Unfortunately, sometimes rhino just have a mind of their own, and they decide they don't want to listen to the helicopter, and they'll run off into the middle of a block. But as much as possible, we try and coax them into an area where we can work with them nicely. How that looks when the dart hits is that once it hits, it takes about 3 to 4 minutes to show full effect of the drugs. And what that'll look like if you're close enough is the rhino will come to sort of a standstill. And at that point, it'll go into sort of a high stepping gait. It looks a little bit like a dressage horse in a sense. So the front legs will sort of be coming up and down. The eyes will be stargazing, and the head will almost be going a little bit side to side. And then at that point, the best way to actually get them down when the ground team gets there is to put the blindfold on and to put some earplugs in. And usually then you can get them down quite nicely like that. Obviously, you might get there and the rhino's already down. And this is obviously white rhino. I'll touch a little bit of black rhino at the end and how that differs a little bit in how they respond to the drugs. But that's usually what it's going to look like from the point that we're in the helicopter with the dart into the rhino, and then hopefully having the rhino down in a decent amount of time close to the ground team. Now, the important thing to realize is that there'll be a few moments of chaos in the beginning. So when you're coming up to the rhino, or you see the team approaching the rhino once it's down, is the first sort of 3 to 4 minutes are a little bit more nervy, I guess, in a sense, that you want to stabilize that rhino as quickly as possible. White rhino, unlike many of the other species, just don't respond very well to the opioids, and it means that we have to do a few things to mitigate it and make it a lot more safer in terms of the immobilization and then essentially the whole process. So what that'll look like is once the rhino is down, you might notice one of our team members rushing out there to the rhino. Either they've put the blindfold on and the earplugs in, and now that rhino is safely down. Now, once it's down, we actually give them a partial antidote called butorphanol. It'll go straight into the vein in the ear. We inject that into the animal, and as soon as that starts to take effect, the rhino wakes up a little bit. You might notice that its head's being held up on its own, its ears are sort of moving around, and it's a little bit responsive to touch and vibrations. That's perfect. That's exactly how we want them. We want them a little bit more awake. They're breathing significantly better, and it's a lot safer. Once the butorphanol's in, we'll put a little intravenous catheter in. So it's a little plastic cannula that we just pop into the ear vein. And the reason for that is that if there's an emergency and there's cardiovascular collapse during the operation, it means we've got access to the cardiovascular system. We've got an immediate spot that we can inject the antidote if we need to wake that rhino up. So a catheter will go into the ear vein as well. Then we really spend some time on repositioning. The way that we want a rhino sitting, ideally, is sort of on its chest and just off kilter, with one back leg tucked nicely underneath the body and the other back leg next to the body. The front legs can be sort of any which way. We've often found if the front legs are bent and flat, they'll often try and maybe stand up on you. So we like to just fold them in, but the front legs aren't as important as the back legs. You've got a very heavy, cumbersome animal. You've put in drugs that are also contributing to blood pressure effects there. And if the rhino sits for too long in an awkward position, it can actually injure its legs or damage its legs where it really struggles to stand up. So we're very pedantic about how we position them. So that's ideally how we want them. So, we'll get hands involved. That's where we potentially might need your help if you're with us on the ground. A rhino is not just like a dog or cat. You don't just pick it up and put it somewhere in a better position. So we might need to use some ropes. We might use a prodder or whatever it might be, but we're going to try and reposition that rhino and get it into a comfortable position that we happy to work with for a few minutes. Once the positioning's done, then we're going to put a little oxygen cannula into the nasal cavity, and we're just providing oxygen there as further support to the entire mobilization, and once again just making it much safer and mitigating some of those negative effects from the opioids. One to be very cognizant of is that white rhino in particular, and sometimes it happens with black rhino, can have significant tremors, especially if they're lying on their side. And usually this is most pronounced in the first sort of 5 to 10 minutes of the immobilization. A lot of that is counteracted by the butorphanol that we give, and then the repositioning often helps to reduce those tremors. If the rhino is lying on its side and you see it tremoring a lot, just understand that it's a drug effect, and we're counteracting that once we administer some of the partial antidote. The next step, so we're going to put a little bit of an eye gel in. It's just a little tube. The reason we do that is that obviously when you're cutting the horn, there's a lot of horn shavings and bits and pieces that are flying around, and they can come through the blindfold and actually end up in the eye, and they can damage that cornea, because during the immobilization, the rhino's eyes will be open the entire time. So we put a little bit of an eye gel inside there to lubricate and catch anything that comes inside there, and that just protects the eyes that much better. Then we'll go to the back, and wherever I've managed to hit the rhino with a dart, and we'll treat the dart site with a little antibiotic intramammary. So this is actually used for mastitis in cow teats, and in the same principle, where the dart hits the animal, we put the intramammary into that dart site and we inject the antibiotic into there. And the reason that's important, I'll explain two things, is one at the end from a safety perspective for you, and then secondary is, there's a lot of dirt on the outside of the animal. When a dart penetrates and pulls that into the dart site, if you're not careful, you can get a dart site abscess forming there, and we want to avoid that as much as possible. So now our rhino is in a good position. Everything from an initial perspective is done. We're happy. Hopefully it's breathing nicely. And at this point, we'll go on with the dehorning process. So what's important to note with the dehorning process, it's not for everyone. So please don't feel shy if you feel you want to step aside. It's a lot of noise. It's a very emotive experience. Please feel free to step aside and wait till the whole operation is done and dusted with the dehorning. But just a few things to understand. We use a chainsaw as a Wildscapes team. Some people like to use a reciprocating saw. But from a chainsaw perspective, we've got two. We've got an electric that's a lot quieter, and we typically use it on the smaller individuals and some of the cows. And then we've got a big petrol chainsaw, which we sometimes need to get through the big, thick horns of the rhino bulls. So with the chainsaw, what's really important to note is, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's essentially like a rhino's fingernail. We use a nail clipper. We can't just take that to a rhino. We need something a little bit bigger, a little bit more intense. And we find a chainsaw is the most effective with a nice sharp chain. You can get it done really quickly, and essentially it should be in a non-painful way. A chainsaw can vibrate quite a lot, so if the rhino is moving around a bit and it's responding or lifting its head, it's not in a pain response. It's just that there's obviously a lot of vibration now going through the head area. So they tend to respond to it. Remember, we've woken them up a little bit, and that's why they tend to respond like that. So chainsaw, we've got the small electric, and then we've got a big petrol as mentioned. Now, if you see me picking up a chainsaw or one of my team and we say we're going to go to the head and now we're going to dehorn, please note it's a chainsaw. We know how dangerous they can be, so please try and not be around the head area at that point. And then one of the biggest things to note is that once I'm cutting, or whoever might be cutting the horn, is that the blade is turning away from us like this. And then that means that anyone that's standing opposite me when I'm cutting, if there's a little horn chip or shaving or whatever it might be, it can get hooked on that blade and it can shoot off at a very rapid rate in that direction. So I always suggest that when I'm cutting, that rather stand a little bit towards the front of the rhino, behind me, or a little bit towards the back of the rhino, a little bit behind the shoulder rather than opposite me. Especially people with cameras, you can get a lot of oil and pieces and that on there, and it can get very damaged. And then obviously if you do want to stand there, just take an extra step back and just make sure you put your glasses on just to protect your eyes if anything does happen to fly off the end of the blade. But once we decide to dehorn, we'll take a little bit of chalk and essentially mark the horn where we want to cut it. So what that looks like is I'll mark, in a very scientific sense, 4 fingers from where the base of the horn meets live tissue. And then I'm going to draw a line with the chalk all around the horn. Now on average, that's about 7 to 9 centimeters. That should give us a really nice buffer above where we're expecting the growth plate to be, where the horn's growing from, as I'd mentioned earlier, where there's a blood supply and there's nerve tissue, and we want to not damage that. So we want to stay away from that growth plate. So we mark nice and high above that. On the back horn, you can actually go a little bit lower. I often mark 2 fingers, but to be honest, you can actually go pretty low there on the back horn, but it's a good starting point. And I find with the back horn being sort of flatter, it's a little bit more difficult to cut that first cut initially. So what we do then is I've marked the horn. I'll make a straight square cut with the chainsaw through both of the horns. Ascertain, what's it looking like? Does it look like we're high enough? We haven't nicked the growth plate or anything along those lines. Okay, great, it's looking good. Sometimes you might notice in the horn tissue, which we can show you in the field, in the whiter or lighter areas, sometimes there's a lot of blood and bruising, and very often that's not actually close to the growth plate. We see that a lot in adult bulls that are fighting. They damage their horn, and obviously they're getting bruising into that horn tissue, and so you get these very dark patches and bruising around the horn. So it's very important to understand the difference between bruising and actually being close to the growth plate. With the horn, the growth plate is typically in a pyramid. So your highest point is in the center and then it tapers down towards the side. So what we want to achieve is we've made our square cut, we've gone across, we want to look at the horn, and now we want to round it off as much as possible. So coming low down, but lower down on the sides and leaving your highest point in the middle. And that just creates, when someone's looking at a rhino, it just creates this idea that a lot more horn is actually taken off than what might be. But that really is the lowest that you can possibly get while still maintaining a little bit of safety for the animal. What we've seen over the years is that on your big adult bulls, we might leave a little extra centimeter or so of horn, just because they tend to fight a lot. And if you remove that horn too close to the growth plate and they fight, they can actually damage that growth plate a little bit, and then down the line you actually get horn cracks or a little bit of damage to the horn. And we want to obviously avoid that as much as possible. So once we've rounded off, we can either use a grinder with a very aggressive hoof disc to actually round it off and smooth it out. I personally and some of the Wildscapes team like to use the back end of the chainsaw blade, and you can actually very quickly just smooth it out and round it off and then just shape it and make it look really good and neat. Once that's done, then we apply a little bit of hoof oil. It's the same that's used for equine hooves. It's a keratin-based substance, the horn tissue, so we try and just support that from drying out and desiccation. Then we'll take some flush and we'll just flush out the eyes. And the reason we put the gel on in the beginning is it catches all the chunks, and then we use the flush and we just flush out the eyes, and that pulls out the gel with all the bits and pieces out of the eyes, just protecting the eyes and make it nice and safe. Now, if all we're doing is dehorning, then at this point the process would pretty much be done. But in all likelihood, there might be a few other things that are going on, especially if we've done a cow and a calf, or if we've done animals that haven't been worked on before. Then what they need is what we call a veterinary genetics laboratory kit, okay? And every rhino that's ever immobilized has one of these kits taken the first time that it's ever immobilized. It's a hair sample, it's a horn shaving sample, a tissue sample, and bloods. So this forms part of a DNA kit for that rhino, and it goes into a massive database for the country. And should there ever be a poaching case or a prosecution or anything like that, then this kit will form part of evidence if it's linked back to the rhino down the line. So these kits are very important. There's location data and everything that's collected. This is usually collected by one of the team, or depending on which province we're in, it'll be collected by the environmental affairs officer. So what's important with the kit is that we also have, by the national norms and standards, a microchip that we need to insert into that rhino if it hasn't been done before. So where that microchip sits is on the left side of the neck, just behind the ear. We put it in there. That's a standard across the country. And then us personally, we put in an extra microchip on the inside of one of the legs. There's a few different places that different teams have done. And the reason for the second microchip is that if in the unfortunate event you do have a rhino mortality, then scavengers tend to like to feed on those soft areas first. So, this microchip in a dead rhino will be gone very quickly if hyenas find it and eat it. And so on the inside of the legs, that microchip's just protected for a little bit longer. And it just means that you can identify who that rhino is if you need to. So microchips are very important. We've got a little microchip scanner that we scan each and every rhino that we do in case a microchip was inserted the first time. Now, if we've done a calf or an animal that hasn't been done before, then we might notch the ears. Now, notching the ears, in a simplistic sense, you've got a rhino's ears. When the rhino is looking at you, what we try to do is we will cut out little triangles in different parts of the rhino's ear. Now, each part of a rhino's ear is associated with a particular number, and each reserve might have a little different notching calculator or a different pattern. So now, for argument's sake, if this is a rhino's left ear and the animal is looking at you and this is the outside of the ear, if we cut a little triangle at the bottom, that's a number 1. If we cut it in the middle, it's a number 100. If we cut it on the outside top, it's a number 2, and on the inside is a 4. So the other ear will be all of those numbers, but with a 0 added, so it'll be 10, 20, 40, and then 200. And so let's say we want to make our rhino number 30. Then what we're going to do is we're going to cut on the right ear, we're going to cut in the 10 point and in the 20 point, and then you see that rhino in the wild, and you'll be like, okay, it has a cut at the 20 and the 10, you add those together, and that's rhino number 30. Okay, so that provides an individual identifier, which is important from a management point of view on the reserves. So it's a lot easier to actually see in person and with pictures and that, but that's just really simply explained. And how we do that is we like to use clamps. So we'll mark with chalk where the notches need to be. We'll put clamps, and then we'll take a scalpel blade, or we'll take a notcher, a triangular notcher, which looks a little bit like this. And then you can see how it'll just cut. We just notch straight in that area, pop it through there, or as mentioned, we take a scalpel blade and we cut out that triangle. Now, obviously the clamps are there to stop the bleeding, so we leave them on there a little bit. And then we've got, looks like a little bit of a spice bottle, but they work really nice for us. It's called potassium permanganate, or commonly known as Condy's crystals. We'll pour that on the cut surfaces, and that essentially works as like a chemical cauterization. So it'll just stop the bleeding, which is really nice. Points that might happen beyond all of that is that we might collar. So there's a couple reserves that utilize foot collars. So we might put a foot collar around the leg. We might put a satellite ear tag into the ear, or we might put a horn pod onto the horn. So there's a few different options on tracking rhinos. Some reserves utilize some of them, some don't at all, and this might not be prevalent to what we're doing, but just in case we are, then it's a lot easier to ask questions a little bit closer to the time, or look out for some of our videos down the line where we'll explain each of the processes a little bit more in depth. So we've got our rhino, it's dehorned, it's collared, it's notched, everything has been done. Usually the process takes about 20 to 25 minutes in total from when the dart goes in. If we are fortunate enough to have you in the field and you're joining us as part of an experience, then essentially this will be the point just before we wake up where we'll take some photos. I'll always communicate with you that we are 2 or 3 minutes from wake up. Let's take a group photo if you'd like to, or any photos, or you want to touch and feel and get a little bit closer. This really is the best time to do it just before we wake up. We're never going to extend an operation beyond what is safe for that animal, and especially if it's just for a people factor, animal welfare is absolutely paramount. So all of that will happen really quickly as we pack up our equipment. And then once we're ready to wake up, we'll all move to sort of a safer location with the vehicles, and we'll sit and watch them wake up. Now, how that works is we've got our catheter. We'll just inject an antidote called naltrexone into the vein, and we expect that rhino to be up within about 90 seconds to 2 minutes. They're usually up and on their way, and non 2+ if it's a white rhino. And what's really important is if we've got a cow-calf or we've got walking companions, is just to stay nice and quiet on the vehicles, because you'll notice as soon as they wake up, they start to contact call each other and they find themselves really, really quickly. So it's a really nice thing to witness if you are able to see that. What's important just before we wake up is that if our rhino has been sitting on the dependent leg that we folded underneath the body for sort of an excessive period of time, or something that we're not comfortable with, especially if it's a very rocky environment, then we'll do one of two things. One, we will roll it onto its side and we'll pump that bottom leg and just get the blood pressure going and the blood supply moving inside there so that it's better perfused and then the leg isn't a dead leg. It's the same principle that if you sit awkwardly on your leg or your arm is pinched in an awkward position, you get that sort of dead arm or dead leg feeling. That's what we want to avoid as much as possible in a rhino. So on its side, pump the leg. What's very important is if you have now pushed it on the side and you've got people that are pumping that leg, the front point will often move and shake side to side. So you need to have someone that's just protecting that bottom eye as well. And that's really an important point when they are on their side. The other option, if you need a little bit more time because of a process of notching or whatever we are doing and it's taking a bit longer, or there's a calf that might have split off and we need to return it back to the cow, then we'll push the rhino onto its side and actually rotate it onto its other leg. Okay, so the leg, let's say it was the left leg that was tucked underneath the body. What we'll do is we'll tuck the leg that's out a little bit further underneath, push the rhino right over, and then push it back up that the leg that was out is now underneath and the leg that was underneath is now out. And then that one will then improve its blood supply when it's like that. If we're doing a black rhino instead of a white rhino, black rhino tend to handle the immobilizing drugs much better, but the offset is that when you dart them, they don't respond like a white rhino in the sense that you can guide a white rhino to a point and it comes to a slow stop, whereas a black rhino sort of, once the drugs take effect, it picks a direction and it goes until it falls into something or it hits something or it's an absolute nightmare. So just note that if we're doing black rhino, it's very possible we're going to have to walk into the middle of the block somewhere because they're deep into the field. Most of the stabilizing things we do with white rhino are not as important in black rhino. They typically don't need the partial antidote. We do give them oxygen if we have it. They do tend to run harder than white rhino, so we might cool them down a lot sooner than we might a white rhino, and you might see that they might sweat a little bit. So we'll always have a big 25-litre water which we might pour over, and then we've got a really nice battery-operated leaf blower which we can use then to put air on that water and cool that rhino down. Probably the key point is that when we wake up a black rhino, nobody is remotely close to it. So we'll do it one of two ways, is either the vet on site will climb into a tree, so they'll wake up the rhino, they'll climb into the tree, and then they'll confirm the wake up and the vehicles will be very far off. Or sometimes the better option is the helicopter actually starts up, the vet jumps into the helicopter, the team wakes up on the ground, everyone moves out, and the helicopter actually watches from a safe distance in the air to see that the rhino is safely on its way. That in essence is the entire process. It seems sort of a long-winded explanation, but in actual fact, when everything's happening, it goes incredibly quickly. A few points just on safety. So we spoke earlier about the intramammary. So where that sits, you'll always have that white tube sitting where the dart has been placed. Now, what can happen when the dart's pulled out is some drug leakage can happen in that area. So I just ask, stay away from the dart site as much as possible. You know, we often repositioning the rhino, and if we're pushing it over and it's a little bit chaotic, you might not be paying attention and inadvertently touch the dart site and maybe get some of the ointment on your hands. Please don't panic. The drugs, they are very potent and they do provide or pose a hazard risk to us. But the reality is that they can't go through your skin, so it's just good practice to come and approach one of the Wildscapes team, wash your hands and just tell us, I've touched the dart site. That's all you have to do. You don't have to panic. But please, as much as possible, so that we avoid that, just try and not touch the dart site or be sort of anywhere in that area. Now, most of the times we're going to be working on Big 5 reserves, and that means that there's other animals around, there's elephant, there's lion, there's whatever that may be. So we'll identify someone on the day that will be the sort of safety officer and the person in charge on the ground. And it's critical that you listen to them at all times when we're going to a rhino that's in the field and coming back. Because as I mentioned, we try and get them close to a road, but sometimes they might be deep in a block where we can't get a vehicle access to. And that means you have to walk there. So as a group, you go with this identified person all together to the rhino. Please don't wander off from around the rhino. If you need to use the bathroom or whatever it might be, please chat to whoever we've identified for safety and let them know you're just going to go behind a bush there. But it's important that you don't wander and that when we wake up the rhino, then everyone leaves as a singular group back to the vehicles. It's really important to not rush in there when you see the Wildscapes team going in there, because they obviously want to get there for a reason. They've got radio communication with the helicopter. If there's a problem, if the rhino's in an awkward situation or going into a bush or falling into a gully or whatever might happen, then we want to rectify that as quickly as possible. But it's a chaotic situation, and with the radio comms only with the team, you're not going to understand what's going on. So hang back with the person that's identified and come in when they say it's safe, because they will have radio communication with the helicopter saying that there's other awake rhino around, or there might be elephants, or there might be lions, or there might be something else. We're utilizing a helicopter, and we just want to be very cognizant of helicopter safety. Sometimes when the bush is very thick, the helicopter might have to land in the road or very close to the rhino. Now, what's very important, if a helicopter's landed, there's absolutely no reason why you should be approaching it. So please, at all times, stay away from it. If for whatever reason, and I don't really see a scenario for it, you need to walk past the helicopter or very close, please be cognizant of some very important points. Any loose items, please make sure that you're holding on to them if those blades are still turning. Under no circumstances whatsoever go anywhere near the tail while the rotors are turning or anything like that. If you ever have to approach a helicopter, make sure it's from the side or the front, and make sure that the helicopter pilot notices and knows that you're there and that you're approaching. Never approach a helicopter from the back end. Make a wide circle and make sure that you're always coming from the front or from the sides. If for whatever reason, you happen to be going in the helicopter, one of the Wildscapes team will make sure that everything is done properly and safely and you approach the helicopter with them. But please, at all times, try and stay away from the helicopter. When we're cutting the horn, especially with a chainsaw, sometimes there can be really big chunks and there'll be a lot of shavings around the floor. I know that it's a very tempting thing to actually pick up a shaving and just put it in your pocket and keep it as a souvenir. Please don't do that. I think it goes without saying that firstly, it's illegal, but second of all, you can find yourself in serious trouble somewhere down the line if you're found with horn shavings in your pocket or anything like that. So pick it up, have a look, but please throw it back onto the floor when you're done with it. Don't try and pocket one and walk off with it. It's just really not a good idea at all. If we're doing cow-calf combinations, is that at all times, if a calf is younger than 18 months, we want to bring it back to the cow. So we might walk a rhino. So if we've got a cow-calf and they've split off a little bit from each other, then what we'll do is we'll use an electric cattle prodder. So what this does is it provides a small shock. And once we've partially given the antidote and the rhino's a little bit more awake, then we use this prodder and a rope around the head and around the back leg, and we actually can safely walk a rhino wherever we might need it. So we might walk a cow to a calf or a calf to a cow, whatever it might be, and just ensure that we wake them up together. If calves are very small, we might put them on the back of a vehicle, or we might, if they're tiny, we'll put them in the back of the helicopter and fly them back to the cow. But if we're doing cow-calves, we ideally want them to go down together and make sure that they wake up together at all times. My last point from a safety perspective is one that sort of goes unnoticed very often. I find that the most dangerous thing on all of these operations is the vehicles. So vehicles will tend to, in these operations, especially if you're standing on the back, they'll accelerate suddenly because they're listening on the radio. They've said, okay, the dart is in, and they rush off there. And now the helicopter says, okay, stop. The rhinos are running over here. Okay, go. So you don't know what's happening on the back. And if you're not holding on, suddenly the vehicle can accelerate and you can fall off the back, or it can suddenly slam on the brakes and then you fly forward into the rails or something. So if you know that we're on the operation and we're mobilizing to a rhino that's being darted, hang on, even with the vehicle stopped, and just know that at any point it's going to stop or go. And then the biggest thing is most of our trees in this country are very thorny, and they've got horribly hooked thorns and long thorns, and they're very often overhanging the road. So make sure your eyes are forward and you're always looking forward. If you're on an open vehicle, they can scratch you in the face. They can really cause a bit of damage. So just be cognizant of that. And obviously when you're moving through the bush and going to the rhino, just think that a tree is going to spike you. And then you're going to be a lot safer and better off if you understand that. That encompasses the whole operation. Obviously, things can change on the day. If you do find yourself joining us, you'll notice that it's really big teams. It's a massive operation. We can't do anything with Rhino unless there's a whole lot of permits and things that are put into place. And so it's important to understand that on the day, you might have an environmental affairs officer there. You might have security there, and then you might have anti-poaching units, and you'll definitely have reserve staff. So where that is important is obviously they all have their roles to play, and please feel free to ask them questions and such. But at all times, it's just good practice if you're taking photos, and obviously photos, videos and such will be discussed on the different reserves on who's comfortable with what. But as a general rule, if you're taking photos, please avoid taking any photos that include any of the environmental affairs officers, security, anti-poaching units, or reserve staff where their badges of the reserves are visible. Also, please turn off your geolocation on your phone. But depending on where we're working, each reserve has its own nuance of how they want things done. Just to finish, it's a really privileged position to be in to do one of these operations. Make the most of it, enjoy it. You don't often find yourself close to a rhino, and I've been talking for a long time and you've been listening to this for a long time, but understand that everything once you're in the field happens a lot quicker than all of this pretty much. So take it all in, feel free to touch, feel, ask questions and make the most of it. And I think ultimately the biggest thing is that animal welfare is at the forefront, and should there be any issue and we're uncomfortable with the operation, we'll can it at any point. Whether or not that's not darting the rhino because we're not happy with its condition, whether or not it's too hot, or it might be that we dart a rhino and for whatever reason, it just doesn't respond well to the drugs. And we have to wake it up in an emergency, we're going to do that. So we're just gonna ask you to bear with us. There's a lot of variables that are absolutely out of our control in a free roaming situation, and we try and mitigate and manage them as much as possible. Thank you everyone for joining us and watching this video. Hopefully we'll see you in the field one day. If you're interested in more videos like this and part of our series, please follow the link below, and also keep your eyes out for any more videos that will be following on from this one with more key factors onto small nuances of a rhino dehorning operation. This video is brought to you by the Conservation Academy. Thank you so much for joining us.